Okay, I think we should probably get started given that we only have 55 minutes on the clock. So welcome everyone. This is the transportation breakout session. So if you did not select this as your breakout group, you may want to make a quick change. My name is Shruti Vaidyanathan. I am the Transportation Program Director here at ACEEE, and I'll be your moderator for the session. Just as a reminder, this session will be exploring a variety of issues, including Netherlands emissions cutting strategies from transportation, fuel economy standards across different countries, and the recently passed US transportation infrastructure bill. A few housekeeping announcements. Each presenter will speak for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we will open up the session for a Q&A. As Steve mentioned earlier this morning, attendees should feel free to ask questions through our discussion via the chat, and I will pose those questions to the speakers during the Q&A session at the end. And lastly, for those of you who have just joined us, we have been adding speaker presentations for attendees to download on the symposium landing page on the ACEEE website. So today we are joined by three speakers on our panel, Sascha Scheffer from the Dutch Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management, Zifei Yang from the International Council for Clean Transportation, or ICCT, and Chris Rawl from Transportation for America. Before I hand the mic over to our first speaker, I just want to provide a little bit of context for this panel. So we heard a lot about electric vehicles this morning during the plenary session, and I just want to stress that when ACEEE discusses efficient transportation policies, we're not only considering approaches to improving the efficiency of vehicles, but also to the transportation system as a whole. We think creating livable communities with accessible and equitable clean transportation systems is important and will require moving people out of single occupancy vehicles and also pushing goods movement to more efficient forms of transportation like rail and sea. So our speakers today are going to cover a wide range of issues across the spectrum, and we'll also touch upon the idea that while electrification is being seen as sort of a big part of the puzzle to reducing carbon emissions in the transportation sector, we will also need to see supplemental action around reducing vehicle miles traveled for both passenger and freight activity. So just a little bit of context for those of you who are attending. On that note, let's move on to our first speaker, and that will be Sascha. Sascha Scheffer is a senior advisor for sustainable mobility at the Dutch Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management, and he works on various themes within the topic of sustainable mobility with a focus on alternative refueling and recharging infrastructure for heavy-duty vehicles. This includes national programs such as the National Charging Infrastructure Agenda and Clean Energy Hubs, as well as international dossiers. So Sascha, I'm going to turn the mic over to you.
Thank you, Shruti, for the introduction, and a pleasure to speak to such an international audience. I'm going to give you a short overview of the broad transport energy efficiency policies that have been in place in the Netherlands for the last years. Also emphasizing as well that my focus area is actually on the improved part of mobility, so the electrification of trucks. But I'm going to provide you also information on what's happening on the avoid and shift parts. So if you could go to the next slide. So this is just a broad table of content. Is like I'll first provide like a bigger picture of how the Netherlands approaches energy efficiency in transport, and then I'll try to provide some key examples within the framework of avoid, shift, and improve. So avoiding transport if it's not necessary, shifting transportation to more efficient modes, mostly away from cars or away from small trucks or vans to bigger vehicles. And then as the last step, improving those vehicle modes by electrifying or using sustainable fuels, or having more stringent fuel economy policies, as Zifei will explain as well in the next presentation. Next slide, please. So I think this captures already the main approach from Netherlands to have more efficient transportation. It's the National Climate Agreement, which was agreed between public and private actors in 2019. this had the goal to have at least 49% reduction of CO2 emissions by 2030 relative to a 1990 baseline. Um, and this climate agreement made a clear sectoral split in terms of responsibilities, where we had 5 main sectors, of which one of them was transportation, where there was then a concrete reduction target of 7.3 megatons of CO2. And within that, it covers all sorts of measures, from sustainable energy carriers to electric traffic, more sustainable logistics, and also more sustainable personal mobility. I'm not sure whether it's readable for everyone what's in this figure, but hopefully it provides a bit of a diverse picture that indeed it's not only about electric cars, it's about improving supply chains, as well as having proper bike infrastructure, good connections with public transportation, having efficient bike couriers for logistics, as well as construction equipment. So it covers a very wide spectrum in terms of policies, and some of them are a bit more soft set, with information campaigns, and others are more stringent in terms of having actual regulations that, for example, from 2025 onwards, it's not allowed anymore in the 30 to 40 biggest cities in the Netherlands to have other other logistics than zero emission vehicles, which will have hopefully a big impact as well on the livability of our cities. Um, Going away from this bit chaotic picture to the next slide, please. Starting with the avoid policies, so making sure that you avoid transportation as much as possible in order to avoid unnecessary emissions or pollution, and then split between passenger and freight. Netherlands, of course, has been quite well known for its bike infrastructure, and I think it works quite well in many places. Living in Amsterdam, they recently finished, I think, one of the widest bike paths, which is, I think, as wide as 4 car lanes and close to the central station. So really impressive improvements there, but it's also really necessary if you see the amount of biking users that cross the central station during the rush hour traffic. But what's also a very important element next to city bike lanes is also to have this intercity bike traffic available, and this exemplified a bit by a big trend that more and more people are also buying electric bikes, which allows within the time travel budget that each citizen normally has of like 1 hour travel each day that he or she is willing to do, and then having proper intercity connections, you can actually have longer distances also being covered by bike users, and that potentially replaces quite a lot of vehicle kilometers from passenger cars, for example. What's also a very important element in terms of the avoid policies is to have a proper urban planning policy where you, when you start building your new cities or neighborhoods, that you have different types of services like supermarkets or shops always within biking distance. And I think Netherlands has had seen some great examples. At the same time, our country is fairly small and can be considered by some countries as a city state where many people still are actually able to live in a nearby city and work in a different city where you that the services are close by, but at the same time other cities are so close that you will actually use your car still for intercity for work traffic, which of course goes a bit against those avoid policies. Car sharing schemes are also really growing, especially in the bigger cities such as Amsterdam. The number of users have tripled in the past couple of years. And definitely, as from a personal experience in the neighborhood around my house, I've seen so many new schemes coming up, and some of them work really well. Others still have to improve, but I think this is definitely also a very important policy in terms of avoiding too many cars in cities. And then from a freight perspective, I think bike delivery is becoming increasingly common in bigger cities, as well as having business travel being reduced. I think the government policy is now already that any place where you have a decent train connection within 8 hours, you have to take the train instead of a plane. And this was a couple of years ago very different. And of course, hybrid working now is like this. This conference is becoming more common, and hopefully, of course, we find the right balance that we still are able to see each other face to face every now and then for strategic meetings. Next slide, please. From the shift policy, so moving away from inefficient transportation modes, going to more efficient ones. There are some, even though we already have quite a dense network of public transport, there are lots of large investments being announced as well. We have a national growth fund where we try to expand some key city connections. I think the majority of the public transport investments are in the Randstad area in the western part of the Netherlands, between Rotterdam, Amsterdam, Utrecht, and The Hague. But especially other regions need to have proper connections to those to big cities hubs as well, in order to have like a proper alternative to the car. Mobility as a service is more and more common. Of course, this is a very broad term and can be multiply interpreted, but I think, at least from personal experience, we have fairly well connected train stations where you can then rent a bike for a day, which you can use the same card as you use for your train, and you can also use those cards for car rental in some cities as well. So this becoming increasingly common as a use case. And for freight, you see more and more city hubs arriving, where there's then trucks shifting their freight in the last mile delivery to have cargo bikes, for example. Um, and next to this, Netherlands has been fortunate to be a delta region where there are two main rivers with lots of inland shipping are placed, the Rhine and the River Meuse. Um, and big investments are being done there as well, in order to enable that share growing as well, relative to the amount of freight transport over the road. Next slide, please. So in terms of improved policies, there's slightly more measures, because those can be slightly more concretely measured. And the Netherlands has the ambition to have all passenger car sales zero emission by 2030, and all public transport as well. Currently, this is also being negotiated in the European Union, where the original proposal from the European Commission is to actually have this target by 2035, but um, given the developments of some bigger member states with more green governments, we're wondering, of course, whether it will stay at the 2035 or hopefully also shift a bit further forward to 2030. And for public transport, I think Netherlands has been a clear example where many of the bus concessions are already being 100% electrified, and we already have 20% of all of our public transport buses electric as of last year, I think. And then for the freight sector, there's also specific targets for different segments of the vehicle market. So zero emission construction logistics, also more sustainable inland shipping, to have also an efficiency reduction of efficiency improvement in terms of CO2 for regional and long haul transport, so making the supply chains more efficient. And what I just mentioned as well, to have zero emission city logistics by 2030, so having zero emission zones where actually internal combustion engine trucks and vans cannot actually access certain city areas. And I think that can bring a lot of improvement in terms of efficiency as well. Next slide, please. So, as my specialization is mostly on electric mobility, I have two more slides on our approach. I think strong government leadership is very important to get electric mobility going. We already have had electric mobility action plans since 2011, so more than 10 years ago, before any of the bigger brands actually had electric vehicles on the market. We also just started with deploying 1,000 recharging points. Starting off with infrastructure, I think is very important, as well as having the fiscal incentives on the so for company car taxes, and as well as for private users for multi-year periods, so that they have enough certainty to invest in this zero emission vehicles. And as I mentioned, the importance, at least from our perspective, is that infrastructure is key, especially for passenger vehicles, to give confidence to EV users that there is infrastructure available when they buy those vehicles, which means you have to pre-invest a bit more and initially than you would see as users, but at the same time it will really pay out over the longer time. And having then also the interoperability between those charging points, that you do not have the need of 10 different payment cards, or that your car is not being recognized by the by the recharging point. And this requires open protocols where all charging point operators can work together in the same language. And public-private cooperation there is a very important element. Next slide, please. So, and then in terms of getting instruments ready for new technologies, from the S curve of innovation, starting with different programs for scientific and applied research. I think for many topics we're already beyond that, and we have had 3 rounds of DKTE transport, which is a pilot program instrument where we've tested a lot of different use cases for zero emission mobility, and now having more and more instruments that are related to financing. So the European Investment Bank and NLVest, having loan guarantees and making sure that we get proper procurement systems in place for our government fleets, but also for the infrastructure on public lands, for example. And over this entire time period, making sure that you have fiscal measures that, of course, we start very generous and become more and more harmonized with conventional vehicles as the new technologies become more and more cost effective. Next slide, please. And this is an example of like one of these pilot projects where there's like zero emission trucks from Albert Heijn, one of the biggest supermarket chains, delivering supermarkets with food, but with electric trucks, and testing out whether it's best to use a plug-in hybrid or a battery electric truck, and seeing how many operations can be executed from the different distribution centers. So just in a small example, but hopefully I provided a clear picture of the broad scope you need as a country to provide efficient policy for transportation.
Thanks so much, Sasha. I think that was a very good overview of the Netherlands' very comprehensive effort to address emissions from the transportation sector. It certainly puts some of the activities happening in the US to shame, but I'm sure Chris can touch on that in his presentation. So next up, we have Zifei Yang. So Zifei is the Passenger Vehicles Program Lead at the International Council on Clean Transportation, and her work is aimed at reducing air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions from passenger vehicles on a global scale. Zifei's research focuses on assessing the potential fuel consumption and emissions reduction from light-duty vehicle technologies, and identifying global best practices in regard to fuel efficiency standards, fiscal policies, labeling programs, electrification, and compliance and enforcement. So Zifei, I will let you take it from here.
Yeah, thank you, Shruti, for the introduction. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the progress of the global fuel efficiency and CO2 emission standards. And since my background is on the light-duty vehicle side, so I will mainly focus on the light-duty vehicle segment. Next slide, please. So improving fuel efficiency of the vehicles also means reducing tailpipe CO2 emissions. In recent years, and also in many countries, it is the decarbonization target and strategies that drive the energy efficiency improvement of the vehicles. So I'm using these figures to provide a big picture here. And the figure shows the baseline CO2 equivalent emissions and mitigation potentials in 2050 by the major transportation segment. It illustrates emission reduction potentials from the light duty, heavy duty, marine, aviation, as well as the low carbon fuels. The yellow bars on the left-hand side of the chart quantify the impact of factors that are expected to drive up greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And the blue, green, and red bars on the right side of the figure shows the estimated potential impact of fuel efficiency improvement zero emission vehicle growth and improve compliance for each segment of the transportation sector. So as the figure shows, the largest single mitigation opportunities in our assessment is the energy efficiency improvement across all modes. And next is the electrification of the light duty and heavy duty vehicles. So this underscores the importance of continuing support for efficiency measures while targeting measures to accelerate EV adoption. Next slide, please. So fuel efficiency or CO2 emission standards, they are mandatory to the automotive manufacturers, and it has shown to be effective in driving down the fuel consumption or CO2 emissions of new vehicles sold to the market. It could push for both progress in adoptions of internal combustion engine efficiency technologies and vehicle electrification from the supply side. So, and these are the two major technology pathways to comply with the standards. A lot of progress has been made on the development of fuel efficiency standards. So this figure compares the countries that have adopted standards for passenger cars. And the solid lines are their historical fleet average CO2 performance in gram per kilometer under the NEDC test cycle. And the dashed and dotted lines are their future targets, either published or proposed. There have been a lot of changes in the past 5 years. First, we start to see longer term targets in 2030 and 2035 standards or proposal. Japan and South Korea now have the targets for 2030, and Europe goes for 2035. The second is we start to see 0 gram per kilometer targets. That means completely phase out of ICE vehicles. So in the recent EU proposal, the proposed zero CO2 emission target means to only sell zero emission vehicles by 2035. And meanwhile, there are also more and more countries adopt fuel efficiency standards. So there are 2 countries that we have not got a chance to add to the figure. One is New Zealand that has passed the regulations for 2023 to 2027 standards. And Chile has also passed the legislation to have fuel efficiency standards by the end of this year or early next year. There are discussions in other countries like Colombia and also ASEAN countries because the ASEAN Secretary have released a fuel efficiency roadmap that require fuel efficiency improvement across all the member states. However, there are also some countries are in urgent need to update their existing standards, such as Mexico, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, in these figures. Some of these countries are working on this, some need more work to make it happen. But in general, we are seeing a pathway for the standards to drive towards a zero and low emission fleet in the future. Next slide, please. The stringent standards is also the key driver behind the rapid EV uptake in Europe. So if we look at the EU sales share in the 3 biggest vehicle markets, not too long ago, back in 2015, the share of EVs among new registrations were below 1% in China, Europe, and US. And then in 2017 and 2018, China took the lead. And then next, it was on Europe to have a jump since 2019 and reached 19% of EV market share in 2021. So the key driver behind the sudden jump of the EV market share in Europe is the pressure to meet the CO2 emission targets in 2021, as well as the incentive provided by the stimulus package in multiple European member states that to subsidize electric vehicles. And of course, like Norway and Netherlands are way ahead in EV penetration, but I'm kind of talking about Europe, China, and US in general as the biggest market in the world. Next slide, please. And along with this trend for accelerated EV uptake speed, there are some countries that have made strong electrification commitment. So the figure shows the full electrification commitment for new passenger cars in some markets. So there are already several countries made 100% EV commitment for a timeline as early as 2025 or 2030. That include Norway, UK, Canada, Singapore, Cape Verde, Iceland, and California as a state in the US. In addition, Europe has proposed a 100% target by 2035. US has the 50% EV target vision by 2030, and China has the 20% by 2025. These regions either only take account of the truly zero tailpipe emission vehicles in their target, that is battery electric vehicles or fuel cell electric vehicles. So those are the blocks in blue, or allow plug-in hybrid electric vehicles to meet the target as well, which are the blocks in orange. But in general, there is a great portion of the global markets that already have some electrification targets. Next slide, please. So the ongoing transition to zero tailpipe emission vehicles is inevitable because it is the only effective approach to deeply decarbonize the on-road transportation sector. So from the carbon emission perspective, if we look at the life cycle CO2 emissions of internal combustion engine vehicles and electric vehicles in different regions, so the life cycle emissions of the electric vehicles are already lower than the conventional vehicles in all major markets with the current grid mix. So we are talking about Europe, US, China, and India. And if you look at 2030, the BEVs are estimated to correspond to 30% to 63% lower life cycle greenhouse gas emissions than the gasoline cars. On the other hand, from the cost perspective, the battery price, which consists a big portion of the cost for EVs, will continue to reduce in the future years. And the electric vehicles' initial cost parities will come within 5 to 10 years for light-duty vehicles. And the cost competitiveness for the consumer approach will approach even faster than the initial cost parity based on the fuel saving. So we may see that EV to play a bigger role in the fleet decarbonization in the upcoming years. Next slide. So the last point I'd like to make is that although the fuel efficiency standards have made great progress so far, there is a need to pay attention to the real world efficiency or CO2 emissions. And the gap between the real world CO2 emissions of the light duty vehicles and their laboratory type approval values has been increasing apparently around the world. So this figure shows the development of the gap in average fuel consumptions by year of the new passenger vehicles sold in China from 2007 to 2021. So it shows that the gap grew from 15% in 2007 to 37% in 2021. So this growing trend was observed across all vehicle segment and in the key vehicle markets in the past years. So the takeaway from this is, from the policy perspective, it will mean that stringent test procedure to reflect the real world driving patterns. There's a need to monitor and regulate real world fuel consumptions and CO2 emissions. And also from the consumer perspective, there's a need to provide consumer information that is close to real world experience. So this will make sure that significant emission reductions does not only happen on the paper or in the modeling, but also in the real world. So these are some key points I'd like to make. So I'll hand it back to Shruti. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Zifei. I think you've identified a number of different challenges when creating fuel efficiency standards and also incorporating electric vehicles. I know the US is considering a lot of these issues as they ponder on their light duty and their heavy duty standards in the coming years. Okay, so let's move on to our last speaker. So next up is Chris Rawl. Chris has been with Transportation for America, or T4A, since 2010, originally serving as Oregon field organizer. Incrementally expanding his role and responsibilities, he became outreach director in 2019 and runs T4A's membership program, keeps partners and allies apprised of developments on transportation policy and opportunities for innovation, and guides T4A's amplification of the local voices critical to reforming the United States transportation system. So Chris is going to talk a little bit more about the VMT side of transportation policy in the United States. So Chris, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Shruti. So next slide. So yeah, talking about where is the U.S. in this whole picture of transportation emissions? Well, we're number one, and that's not a good thing. We're the top emitter in the world of transportation greenhouse gas emissions, and that's not just because we're a large nation and a wealthy nation. So which I'll get into. This data is pulled from ACEEE's scorecard, which was just released, has a lot of great data just to be able to compare countries. So why is this? Why is the US not great at transportation emissions? Next slide, please. Well, for one thing, there's definitely a trend towards larger vehicles that's been taking place the last 10 to 20 years. We have pretty good fuel efficiency standards, or not terrible ones, but some of these largest vehicles kind of skirt around those requirements. And so you see a lot of large pickup trucks and SUVs, and an additional downside of these vehicles, besides guzzling more fuel, is that they contribute to a more dangerous environment for people biking and walking, and even for folks in other cars. You can't see as well out of them, and they will strike the body in a way that is more likely to hurt or kill someone if they're hit. Next slide, please. But the bigger picture here is really our sprawling, car-dependent built environment in America. So in most communities, it's very difficult to participate in society without a car. We think of America as like, oh, Americans love their cars, but actually what we love is being able to participate in society. And we live in an environment where you can't do that in a lot of communities if you don't have a car. So yeah, this is a huge challenge. And if you go to the next slide, you can see that in terms of the miles driven, we are again number one. We drive 3 times further than folks in the Netherlands every day on average. So this is a real central challenge for us in the United States. We need to figure out how to provide better options for people, not just to address emissions, but also the equity and just economic implications of having to put so much money into everyone having their own car to get around. So how are we tackling it with our organization? Next slide, please. We have 3 main avenues of approach. The first is prioritizing maintenance. We spend a lot of money on highways in the US, and if we focus that money on actually just maintaining our highways, which many of them are in not great shape, that could reduce the amount of highway expansion we're doing. Highway expansion is going to induce more driving, and so we're trying to shift to an emphasis on maintenance. Next slide, please. In addition, we need safer streets. The way we design streets in the US has a big emphasis on speed and moving cars quickly, and that creates environments that are dangerous in communities where people might be walking and biking, or even for people in cars who are just trying to turn or meet in an intersection. So we need to shift that. And then next slide, please. The way that we target transportation investments in the US tends to be focused on congestion, this idea that we've got to tackle congestion. It's not working. We've invested in increases in lane miles in every metropolitan area in the country, and every single metropolitan area in the country over the last 2 decades has had increases in congestion to various degrees. So we're sort of have this failed approach. We need to shift to looking at a new measure of how we can access the things we need to get to. How many jobs can I get to in a reasonable amount of time, whether I'm walking, biking, or driving, or using public transit. And when we start to look at things this way, we can think about land use solutions, not just transportation solutions to our challenges. And then next slide, please. We are also working in the electrification space. We're co-leaders of a coalition called CHARGE, the Coalition Helping America Rebuild and Go Electric. And the role that we're kind of playing in this group, which is focused on electric vehicle infrastructure, heavy duty vehicles like trucks and buses, and electrifying public transit. We're focused on making sure we do this in a way that doesn't preclude the efforts we need to make around reducing or creating more options for people to do things other than drive and to be able to drive less. So locating EV infrastructure in a way that isn't going to preclude bus lanes and bike lanes, thinking about targeting investments in electric trucks to areas where there are communities that have been impacted by the emissions around ports, for example, and then with public transit, electrifying public transit while we actually increase public transit service rather than electrify at the expense of service, because our public transit service in many communities in the US is pretty anemic. Next slide, please. So are we getting this done? Is this happening in terms of national transportation policy? Well, not yet. The infrastructure bill that just passed recently, that's been mentioned once or twice already in the symposium, huge increases in investment in transportation, including big increases in investment in public transit and in passenger rail, but also big increases in highway funding. So all of the above approach, and that means there's a big question, next slide please, about how we're going to spend this highway funding. The way that we tend to structure investment in transportation in the US is to invest a ton of money in the status quo, which is highway expansion. That blue half of the pie is representing kind of the biggest highway program, which tends to invest in larger highways, some maintenance, but also expansion. And then other programs that are flexible, like this red wedge, the surface transportation block grants, that's really flexible funding that can be used for a lot of different things, whether that's making roads more complete streets. It can also be used for highway expansion or for public transit. And then we have lots of little programs that are meant to fix the problems that are created by these big programs. So the yellow wedges are investments in active transportation like biking and walking, and the carbon reduction program is shown there as a little red wedge in the upper left. So we've got these sort of little programs that are supposed to fix the problems that we continue to generate with our bigger investments. So that's a challenge. The way that we do transportation policy in the US is we pass what's a transportation bill every 5 to 7 years that sets policy. And so there's not a lot of policy knowledge in Congress. The staffers who are doing transportation are also doing other topics, because if you were just doing transportation, you wouldn't have anything to do for several years in these times in between when we pass the transportation bill. So that creates a challenge. And then next slide, please. We also have a lot of polarization in the US. We still have a lot of political leadership that are denying that climate change is even happening or that it's human caused. So just some huge challenges there, a lot of political grandstanding. The challenge that I mentioned in terms of having a long period between investment in transportation and a lack of policy knowledge in Congress is starting to shift a little bit. Next slide, please. We've seen the formation of what's called the Future of Transportation Caucus, which is a number of representatives in the House who actually do have a lot of knowledge around public transit and land use and how we design communities to have more options for people. And so they were very influential in at least a portion of developing this last transportation bill. Next slide, please, where the House bill actually had a great deal of the reforms that we would have liked to have seen. Unfortunately, the Senate passed a bill that did not address those three principles I talked about earlier: maintenance and safe streets and access. And in the end, the infrastructure bill that was passed just included the Senate policy and ignored the House policy. So that's where we are today. And that concludes my presentation. Hope there's some interesting questions we can address.
Thanks so much, Chris. I think you touched on a number of issues that folks are interested in chatting about. So on that note, let's get to the question and answer session. And there have been questions coming in for each of the speakers sort of individually, and then I have a couple that I can pose sort of more broadly. So one of the first questions we had was for Sasha. Sasha, so given that the Netherlands is the second largest European buyer of Russian oil, has there been any sort of recent discussion about ramping up transportation efforts even more to sort of address the fact that there may be shortages coming through in the future?
Thanks. That's a very relevant question. I'm not sure whether I can answer it 100%, but I think you're right that we are one of the largest importers of Russian oil, but I'm also not 100% sure whether we actually consume all of that oil in the Netherlands itself. We of course have big refining capacity in some of our bigger harbors like Rotterdam. So we cannot apply all of those like reductions just by ourselves. We need also collaboration with other countries that are working together with our harbors, with our oil production. I think this week as well, the government has launched various campaigns to conserve energy, mostly related actually to natural gas at the moment, recommending households to put their heating down with 1 or 2 degrees. I think we also support in general the 10-point plan of the International Energy Agency for reducing energy in the transportation as well. And some of the measures actually have already been in place, not necessarily directly because of the Ukraine crisis, but also because of other policy constraints. For example, we already have a maximum speed on our highways of 100 kilometers per hour because we had excess nitrogen emissions due to various reasons. But I think the government is increasingly looking at this topic, but I'm not 100% sure whether we already implemented then all these measures in the 10-point plan from the IEA, but I think this is becoming increasingly important topic for us.
Great, thank you, Sasha. And sort of moving on to another big elephant in the room, Chris, a question came in about whether, since we're seeing an increased shift to teleworking due to COVID, do we anticipate that that is going to cause a general overall decrease in the vehicle miles traveled in the United States? And is that going to be a sustained trend that you see happening?
That's a great question, and the answer is really interesting. So we did see a drop in vehicle miles traveled or vehicle kilometers traveled initially. Traffic is back, and it's back, but in a very different pattern. And this has implications for not just for our roads and for emissions, but also for how we plan our public transit systems, because people are still working from home a lot more than they were in the past. But they're still going out and doing things. And so there's this peak of traffic that happens in the afternoon instead of at the typical morning and evening rush hour. So folks are going out and running errands. And because communities in the US are designed in a way where you kind of have to do that by car, where it's most convenient to do it by car, that's what people are doing. So all these cars come out on the road in the afternoon. And the question that it begs for our public transit systems is a lot of them are very much designed around the 9 to 5 commuter. And so that's a problem because that's not coming back at the same level, and people do have these other needs. Most of the trips that you make throughout the day are not your trip to work and back. It's going to do these other errands, getting groceries, that kind of stuff. So we need to redesign our transit systems to be more, for those everyday trips.
And following up to that, given that we're sort of seeing a rebound, I think, in traffic patterns and travel patterns, I think a number of our attendees have identified the need to integrate land use planning into transportation planning efforts to make sure that we're creating the communities that can actually support efficient transportation options. Do you see a role, given what you have noticed as part of the infrastructure bill negotiations, for the federal government to play in sort of dictating what those land use patterns look like across the country?
Well, that didn't happen to a large degree in this infrastructure bill, but there were policies in the House bill that could really move us in that direction that we're hopeful could be part of the discussion the next time around. So this whole concept of access, measuring how many jobs or essential destinations you can get to in a reasonable amount of time, that takes land use into account. It also takes transportation into account, and it creates an opportunity to have a conversation when we want to improve access about addressing it through land use and incentivizing, because land use decisions in the US are generally made at the local level, at the city and county level, but to at least incentivize those municipalities to make decisions, taking that into account and taking advantage of those opportunities.
Yeah, and actually one of the things that ACCCC was particularly focused on in the infrastructure bill was the implementation of greenhouse gas performance metrics, which would have, I think, sort of done some of the work at the federal government level to bring those two planning areas together. So we're crossing our fingers that that will happen sometime in the future. But on that note, Sasha, so one question I had for you, one of the main things that I think different jurisdictions in the US have struggled with is sort of understanding the greenhouse gas impacts of their transportation investments and how they translate to actual progress towards broader greenhouse gas goals. Could you talk a little bit about how the Netherlands sort of thinks this through and whether there are any sort of guidelines in place for tracking those impacts?
That's a very good question. So what you, in terms of investment impacts, I think what we at least see is that we perform so-called societal cost benefit analysis on our infrastructure planning, and I think we've been able to at least quantify as well the benefits that, for example, bike infrastructure deliver relative to expanding roads, for example. And I don't know the exact details of that, but I think like having a proper framework of well-working, well-functioning indicators for this societal cost-benefit analysis are key, and as well as then integrating that into the actual investment decision process by organizations that deploy the infrastructure, and then on some levels is the municipalities, but as well as my organization, for Rijkswaterstaat, which maintains the national roads.
Okay.
So
Great.
that's one small example in terms of time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And that's a helpful example. Thank you. So Zife, I haven't forgotten you. So moving on to your presentation, one of the questions that we received is, do you have any suggestions on how researchers can sort of account for the disparity in lab test numbers versus real world vehicle emissions data? I know ICCT is sort of at the front lines of some of those discussions. So if you could sort of talk through some of the approaches that you've taken in your research to bring that gap a little bit closer, I think that would be helpful.
Yeah, so yeah, as for our research efforts, we have been like tracking the kind of the real world to laboratory gap over years, like mainly for Europe. And we did some studies for Japan, US, and China, and China has been updated. So like kind of from our perspective, whenever we want to modeling or look at the impact from the real world perspective on the carbon emissions, we make some adjustment, from the kind of the type approval data using the kind of the gap or the percentage we observed across the countries. So yeah, so we use those for kind of estimation of the real world impact. And also, this is not, I see like in the comment that I think this is not a kind of like a negative things, because like if you're thinking about the US, they actually take that into consider. Like they have the 2 cycle for the type approval value to determine the compliance to the standards. But on the other hand, they have the labeling value, which to kind of is like the main purpose is to get the value closer to the consumer's experience. And also in the US regulations and in the reportings, they have been transparent in the labeling value as well as the real world fuel efficiency value. So I think, yeah, those are some numbers that can be used for academic purpose. And for the other countries where the data is, less available, like, yeah, that is what we usually use. Like we use the data collected from the consumer report or other sources and use that as the adjustment factors for other modeling practices.
Great. And is there a mechanism for this data collection in some of the countries outside of the United States where you're looking to collect sort of consumer feedback on on real world fuel efficiency?
Yeah, I don't think now there's like any official channel to do that, but in the Europe, like now they are trying to use the OBD system. So they want to use the onboard fuel consumption monitoring system. And I think Europe is in the process of thinking about requiring manufacturers to report their real world fuel efficiency or CO2 emissions through that system. Yeah, so in short, there's no established system now, but this is definitely like a policy directions in the future.
Okay, that's great to know. And then the other question I had for you, Zifei, is that so it's become very obvious from your presentation that there's this global commitment to electrification, but I think it's going to take fleets a while to sort of electrify entirely. So I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit as to the kinds of pressure that different countries are putting on maintaining improvements in internal combustion engine vehicles to make sure that there isn't any sort of loss, in progress towards like greenhouse gas goals. I know that that's something that is important in the next round of the US standards. Are other countries sort of dealing with similar issues, or are they sort of almost entirely focused on EVs as the solution?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think, yeah, in general, we're thinking, like from the standards perspective, if you get a standard stringent enough, you will be able to kind of push for the decarbonization of the fleet overall. And it depends on the manufacturer choose the pathways to comply with the standards, which kind of the improvement of the IC technology, or they can choose to, accept as an base. For some countries, they set like that mandate to specifically kind of require certain portion of the produced fleet to be electric vehicles. But like from what we observe, like the ZEV mandate requirement is not like stringent enough to kind of to prevent the technology improvement from the conventional vehicles. But on the other hand, like we have been thinking something like at least to have a minimum standard requirement for the ICE technologies, at least to not to have kind of like a backward movement for the ICE technologies, right? So kind of like as a backstop. For some countries, they have this as a backstop for ICE technologies, but for some countries, it's not. So yeah, I'll say like it's a combination, but at this point, it kind of depends on the manufacturers to determine the technology pathway. Great.
Thank you. That was super helpful. So we have just a couple more minutes left, and I think I want to pose a question to Chris that has come up in our research, and I think folks are interested in hearing about. So I think rural areas in the United States pose very different challenges when it comes to addressing transportation emissions. So one of the questions we received is, could you speak to what is being discussed and done with respect to transportation electrification in the more rural areas in the US? And I think maybe we can make that even broader. What is being done to address transportation emissions more broadly in rural areas?
Yeah, it's ironic that the political power in the US tends to skew towards rural. They're sort of overrepresented in the way our government's structured, and yet rural issues are so poorly addressed. We sort of use rural transportation issues as an excuse to not address our issues in the United States, because really a lot of smaller towns and cities and cities that serve large rural areas, they have a lot of similar needs to other cities, where they need more transportation options, they need investment in their downtowns, and in a lot of places it's not happening. With regard to electrification, I'll just share that in the infrastructure bill that just passed, there's two big programs around EV infrastructure. One is a $2.5 billion program that's very flexible, and it's kind of going to hopefully do a lot of innovative things. And then there's a $5 billion program that's really focused on just creating certainty for longer distance travel for electric vehicle owners. So is there going to be a charging station midway so that I can get, between two cities? And so that's a place where we're likely to see a lot of investment in rural communities, and there's an opportunity to, because an electric vehicle is different, you got to stop and charge it, and maybe have a meal there or see what's in that little small town. There's an opportunity for some economic development